Hi there, everybody. I'm hoping you're receiving this transmission successfully. I just will be using the record feature today to offer you some visibility of one of the projects I worked on very recently. Unfortunately, I can't be there in the room with you today. I hope you don't mind that this recording offers an alternative experience. So what I'm going to do is I'll introduce a slide deck. This is a project that I worked on about 2018 heading into 2019, and what makes it somewhat interesting is how complex it was to get off the ground. And I was having a conversation with somebody within the CoreNet community about it at the time, and as we traveled through the conversation, they asked if I would, use this as a subject matter for some of the students at CoreNet, and as a result of that, I've delivered it a couple of times actually, and the iteration I'll be sharing with you today is probably the most recent one. But without taking any more of your time, what I'll do is I'll jump straight into it right now. I'll start by sharing my screen, of course, and I'll just walk you through the content. As you can tell, I work for ABB. This project was not performed when I was at ABB. It was before in my previous life, so I hope you don't mind. Let me take you through that. All right. So, by way of introduction, my name's John Corbett. I'm the country real estate manager here at ABB for Australia, New Zealand. I cover corporate real estate in every aspect here at the company. I've been doing it for about 30 odd years. Only been at ABB for about 2 years now, but really enjoy this way of life and the work that I do, particularly in solving complex problems around, getting real estate to work. I always describe it as our job is sort of the meat between the sandwich. You've got real estate, which runs on its own wavelength, and then business, which runs on a different wavelength, and we have to connect those dots. And the story today we'll talk a little bit more about that really, and how we go about doing it, and some live examples of how we've done it. Heading into the first slide, of course, this is just an introduction to, if we start to look at how corporate real estate organizations are structured, it's quite linear to a large degree. So you've got somebody the head of, and you've got these different roles and functions that then support individuals, etc., and so forth, and tied to processes. Often those processes and frameworks are quite defined and quite structured. So the organizational structure kind of complements how we do things, and the processes built around the things that we do. The next slide really talks about how we operate within a generic human-centric environment. So if you just think about how we interact as humans, it's a far more engaged and unsequential, I suppose is another way to put it, using WhatsApp group chats and such like. These are the highly dynamic ways of interaction, and we find ourselves performing highly interactive workflows as well, which are far more dynamic than what we had them before. We often working on our laptop and we're pivoting from one thing to the other. It's called the workflow pivot, and that's basically being fueled by digital tools and how we do things. So we're moving in slightly different circles, and where it starts to become interesting is that on the left-hand side is essentially how corporate real estate is often set up. So it's structured and defined, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. A lease starts here and a lease ends there, and the walls are built here, they don't move, and everything's very structured and fixed, whilst again the way we operate is very dynamic and unstructured, I suppose. And so we got this clash, and so this is something that I start to you'll start to experience, if you haven't already, with how we work within these companies. The business is moving very quickly and spinning on a dime, whilst real estate is quite lethargic and slow moving. And so we sit with this challenge of trying to make these two environments come together, and hence me referring to as the juxtaposition, because they're quite opposite, right? And I'm finding that what we're seeing on the right hand side of the screen there, I hope it's your right, which is the dynamic workflows, is more typical of how we operate in an everyday context. And so we need to find ways to get these structured processes to correspond. The interesting part about all of this is when we start to talk about corporate real estate, and you don't go to a university and study to become a corporate real estate person. You're not becoming a doctor or a scientist or a surveyor or an engineer. It's kind of one of those skills that gets built up over time, I suppose. And most of the people that I interact with in the industry have found their way to corporate real estate versus, again, just studied corporate real estate. And so if we start to look on the one side of the screen, there you can start to see where the bulk of folks' careers have commenced: property valuation, real estate agency, facilities management, designing. Some of them are HR. Some of them started as executive assistants, and many have been financial controllers as well. And there's lots of other ones there too. Myself, I come from a property valuer background. Now, why this is interesting is because you'll start to see that as you go through your career in the corporate real estate space, you almost, well, this is certainly for me, my objective was to position myself to be able to be exposed to a lot of different components that make up the corporate real estate landscape. So I can be a little bit of a jack of all trades and know a little bit about everything versus one thing, because that's basically, how this works in real time. It's far more a generalist role, but you need to be scientific when you need to be scientific and analytical when you need to be analytical, etc. If you don't, it can be vague and you get crossed over and things fall apart, right? So what I'm going to do is, again, just use today as introduce you to an example of a project that I did that kind of corresponds with some of the themes I'm sharing with you in this introduction. We'll start off with a bit of a case study, and then we'll talk about the corporate real estate personas that we have to deal with, how we work as a cohort, and obviously the skill sets that we need to muster in order for us to become efficient in what we do. Okay, so we'll start off with a little bit of a story. Now, this is the map of Singapore. For those of you that aren't familiar with Singapore, it's in Southeast Asia. Singapore is not a very big country. It's quite small, as you can tell. It's a small little island. And interestingly enough, if you look at the middle of the screen to the bottom there, we've got that purple triangle. This neck of the woods where the star is, that's basically your CBD area. Yeah. Now, where this story starts is that in this particular case, we had a building in this general CBD area. In fact, exactly where that triangle is at the bottom down here, which is in the CBD but slightly off center. Yeah. Um, what happened at the time was we had very cheap rent that came off the back of the first avian flu crisis, excuse me, that occurred in the early 2000s, late 90s, and at that point in time, rents dropped quite substantially in Asia, and Singapore was no exception. And so we had very, very low rents when we moved into this building about 99, 2000, there or thereabout, right? Even though that there was a tech boom, it was, the market got subdued as a result of that. Continue forward a couple of years and rent started to pick up quite materially. And we were sitting in a situation where come 2018, our rents had jumped up, right? And when we started to talk about the market, when we started here, we were paying $1.67 a square foot from memory. That slowly crept up to $2 or $3 a square foot, which was becoming quite expensive. I know it doesn't sound like much today, but when you started off a base of 1.5 and you're up at 3, you've already doubled your rent in the context of these things. And as the market continued to squeeze, with things became more expensive to the point where, even during the GFC, where rents had cracked just before the GFC rather, so that was 2008, the rents were stepping up closer to $10 a square foot, which was quite material. Luckily, of course, our leases at the time allowed us to step over those problems. But come 2018, I think it was, our lease was coming up, and things were getting expensive again, and we were at that sort of $10 to $12 a square foot type scenario, and we had to find a way to mitigate that. And so where the story started was just before the GFC, which when things were very expensive, and what we decided to do at the time was to step across to what you see on the right hand side of the screen over here, which is where Changi is, right? So Changi, for everybody that knows, is the main airport in Singapore on the right hand side, and this general area is a bit more of a fringe location, and it's relatively cheap, and in the Singaporean context. And the reason why it's cheap is, well, it's off to the side. There's not much going on in that neck of the woods other than a lot of residential. However, there are some notable head offices there at the time. There was RBM and others that sort of found their way out there, but it wasn't particularly interesting, to be honest. You spoke to anybody in Singapore about moving to Changi, and it was like moving to the other end of the world. No one wanted to do it. Everyone hated it. And that made life pretty interesting for us, because the benefit that was coming to the company was more of a financial one and was really working against us from a staffing standpoint. So it had a lot to do with how we won the hearts and minds. But the summary of all of this is that we decided at that point in time to move out there. Now, our rental, was mitigated. So instead of paying the big numbers over here at sort of the $8 to $9 a square foot, we ended up back there about $2.50. And don't quote me on these numbers. I'm going back a good number of years now, but it was relatively inexpensive, and we built a reasonably decent building in that neck of the woods. Fast forward 5 years from them. So 5 years going forward. So we're sitting at about 2018 now. So we were doing deals just before the GFC, just after the GFC, there or thereabout. And then 5 years forward from that, we're sitting at 2018. We're sitting out here in Changi. At this point in time, the leadership wasn't happy with being over here, and they wanted to get back to the city, and they want to move real quick. So I had to work out how we were going to do that. And what became, interesting for us was, well, the rents were low. So if you're coming off a pretty low rental base, it's very difficult justifying coming back to the city, regardless of, the reduction of space and other things. So what we decided to do was, look at this from a completely different lens. So think about, how we could change the way we work. How could we, look at multiple different influences to justify getting there. And at the end of the day, what it came down to is we ended up moving where you see this, excuse me, blue triangle to the left, which is a Maple Tree Business City, um, which is slightly off center, but it's a good location in the context of the building quality, and there's a lot of M&Es that are based over there, so it has a lot of gravitas and certainly a lot of scale. But at the end of the day, it still meant that we were paying something in the order, forgive me, about $20 million more than we would have paid otherwise. And so we had to justify why we were going to pay more rent, even though we had gone from 120,000 square feet, we'd reduced this to 80,000 square feet quite aggressively. And remember, this is pre-pandemic, okay? So big numbers, but we had to find a way to justify the means. One of the more interesting parts about this story was I had to understand, if we were going to spend this extra $20 million incremental, the question was, what are we buying? Like, what are we going to get for our money? What's the biggest bang for our buck? If you were to spend $20 million, what are you actually buying? And so when I took it back to the leadership team and I asked them this question, the answer to them was quite a simple one. And that was, well, we're going to keep our staff happy because they'll come into the office more. At that point in time, we were still working in a hybrid context, even before the pandemic, of course. But for them, it was a case of the staff didn't want to be out here, and that by investing back in here, we were going to get a bigger bang for our buck, and we'll be able to increase productivity and et cetera and so forth, which made a bit of sense. Okay, so happy days. However, where things start to become interesting is that I couldn't just let that be. I had to interrogate that a little bit further. So what I did was I said to myself, okay, well, if people are going to come into the office more, what are they coming to the office today at? Like, what's the benchmark? And it was roughly a badge-in rate back then of about hmm, I think about 45% there or thereabout, maybe edging 50%. It was in that order. And so I thought to myself, well, okay, if it's 45 to 50% now, what was it when we were in the city? Because we were slap bang in the city a couple of years prior. What was it then? And fortunately, I had access to all the tripwire data that we used back in the day. So I started to interrogate that data. And that was not much greater. It was only about 54%. So maybe, difference between 45 and 54, that's 9 to 10% delta between these two. But then I looked at this a little bit deeper to say, okay, if it was 54% back in the day, um, when we moved to Changi, what was it immediately after we moved? Like we had data, within the 6 months of us moving there, what was it then? And it turned out that it was roughly the same. And that's where I started to get interesting because I was like, okay, so it wasn't the change from one location to the other that created a problem, it was something else. And then when I started to interrogate the data even more, I started to learn that the drop off of the show up rates only occurred about 18 months after we moved. Okay, so that again reinforced it wasn't the move itself, it was something else. What had changed? And then I started to look at other influences that came on board at the time. And these days, if we think about the pandemic and everything else, this is pretty known to us now, but back then it was a little bit different. And what I started to see was that internet speeds had increased at the home quite substantially. And so we started to see that people were more comfortable with working at home as a result of that. We also started to see that the introduction of digital tools, and we're using Microsoft Teams now. At the time we weren't, we were using a different product, a Cisco WebEx product. That had taken up a fair bit. So we got the tools for digital work. Working from remote sites starting to improve. We're starting to see internet speed starting to improve. We're starting to see internet costs starting to reduce. And we could start to see that as I started to benchmark the badge-in rates to these activities on a timeline, we could see that there was a correlation. And so we started to learn that the move wasn't so much location orientated. It was partly location orientated. I'm not denying that, but it wasn't the sole impact. So I started to realize that if we were to move over here, we were never going to get to where we wanted to be. That it was always going to be lower as a result of new ways of working. However, this is where things get really interesting. what I started to then do was look at commute times, because the argument was if Changi was far away and the commute times were longer, that would just add more fuel to the justification of working from home. So I started to then benchmark where everyone lived on the island. It was quite an extensive exercise. And I started to look at the travel times, the commute times from where they lived to Changi, where they lived to Maple Tree Business City, and where they lived to two other sites that we had identified as potential options in this scenario. The interesting part in all of this was Changi was the quickest for anybody to commute to. So we started to learn that it wasn't commute times that was creating the problems, it was something else. Yeah. And so where it started to get even more interesting, now we started to then announce to the staff that we were heading and we were moving closer to the city, because for those of you that aren't familiar with Singapore, Singapore has a very CBD culture. Everyone comes together. And if for anyone that's done work in these in Asia, you'll start to learn, particularly with even with Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, Kowloon, which is on the on the mainland itself, no one wants to work in Kowloon. They all live in that general area, but they don't want to work there. They all want to actually commute further to go to the island of Hong Kong, because that's where everything happens in Hong Kong. And so you start to learn it's not where, people don't want to work where it's convenient for them to work most of the time. They want to go to the place where everybody else is. And so if you think about a CBD environment, they connect with other people at lunchtime, after hours, and drinks. And so if you live and breathe Singapore, you'll notice that people go to the CBD on the weekends. It's a big part of their culture. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, all things considered, we're going to be, we might not get this 100% accurate, but I believe that people will be pretty pleased with the fact knowing that we're going back to a generic CBD environment. And that's when the wheels fell off, because at this point in time, um, I refer to this as the Brexit moment. This is when the voting in the UK was being performed to look at whether the UK wishes to leave European Union or not. And everyone obviously wanted to leave, and then you had others that didn't, etc., and so forth. And where it started to become interesting, as we started to make the announcements to the staff, they actually got quite upset with the fact that we were moving from Changi back to the CBD. And I'm thinking to myself, what is going on here, man? Everything tells us that you want to be here. Why are you pushing back? And again, I started to look at behaviors and habits and routines, etc., and so forth. And what it really came down to was the following, which was very interesting. Because in the Singaporean context, the office was so far removed from everything else. If somebody was, working from home and they didn't want to come into the city, into the office, for whatever reason, they could just say to their boss, listen, I don't want to come to the office. It's a real pain to get there, etc. and so forth. Would you mind if I work from home? And the bosses were like, happy days, go for it. Yeah, Changi's terrible. I can understand why, etc. And so as we start to interrogate the data, we start to realize that if we start to move closer to the city, the staff would feel they wouldn't have the permission, the social permission to work from home. And so that's why they didn't want to move. Can you believe it? After finding all this money to move and all these justifications, a beautiful new office and all the rest of it, they weren't happy because they felt that they would now be not forced to come into the office, but influenced to come back into the office. And so we looked at all sorts of different ways of mitigating this with travel and all sorts of things with, bus services and et cetera and so forth. And really what it came down to, what I'm trying to summarize with you in a nutshell, is that this was a human thing. And so as long as the humans could make the decisions, which is essentially the gift that, staff were given, which is the ability to choose their choice offering, they were going to go where they wanted to go, not where we demanded they would go. And they would find their ways to other places at their choosing, not if they were told to go somewhere. So where all this starts to come together is that we had a very mixed bag of, high cost, low cost finance. You had a bunch of leadership. And by the way, when I took this information back to the leadership team, they were blown away because it kind of blew everything out the water insofar as the justification for the extra $20 million. It couldn't be justified now because we couldn't get traction. But we had to look at it from a multiple of different lenses to understand the value proposition. Let me be upfront. The project overall at the end proved to be very successful. Okay, it was very, very well received, but the value proposition was different. And so I had to work out what was the value proposition. And for me, it really came down to making it the greatest place to work, to get work done so you can get home to your kids. That's what I used to share with them. And just changing the way we operate and introducing new concepts. And so, as I took the leadership team and as I took the staff through the strategy of what we were trying to do, I'd done project not dissimilar to this in Sydney, actually, where we looked at a very different concept of a place to work. For me, it was making it the easiest place to get work done so I can get home to my kids. That was the story. It wasn't a case of trying to make up excuses like, oh, we got great food and great this and great that. I had a different view. I believe that people come to the office to get work done, and that's why they do it. And if somebody argued with me, I'd ask them this question. So when you go into the office on a Saturday morning, is everybody there like they were on Friday? No, they're with their real friends somewhere else, right? So I just acknowledge it for what it is. So when I start to look at digital workflows versus physical workflows, you're working from your laptop, you don't have to book anything. You can just jump in and out of workflows and do what you want to do. When you came to the office, there's a lot more work involved. You had to get there, you had to book things, you had to time things, you had to go from one place to the other. It was far more complicated, not to mention the commute time. So the amount of effort and friction involved with a physical office was far greater than working remotely from your laptop, which gave you a laptop is a very efficient tool. I won't go into a whole bunch of detail. There was a lot of strategy that went into that piece and how I did it. So that's not the objective today. But what I am trying to share with you is I had to think differently and get into the mind of the audience and be able to correlate that and convert that into a value proposition that worked both for them, obviously the people that were paying the bills. And so I had to think differently and think outside the square, etc., and so forth to get this over the line. And so if we start to now rewind and start to, untangle the sequences of activities that I did, and that's what today is all about, to take you through how I arrived at this. Again, this was ended up being a very, very successful project. We'll start to see that there's quite a lot of complexity involved. So the first part is the corporate real estate personas, right? And what I'm sharing with you today is just on this slide, is just some of my thoughts. So the first thing I had to do was I had to listen, right? So I had to build trust through what I call continuous curiosity, asking the questions rather than making statements. I'll give an example of this, right? So I was putting my strategy together, and I was sharing all of these things and how I'd done it in Sydney, Australia, for example. And a lady put up her hand and in a town hall setting, and she said to me, "John, that's great. Thanks for sharing us. But we Singaporeans, we different." And it's easy for us to stand up and say, "Well, no, this is how we're going to do it." But I just took it on board and I said, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "Do you have Facebook?" And she said, "Yes." And folks, I'm going back a couple of years now. There's all sorts of TikTok and things now, but it wasn't there at the time. So she said, "Yes." I said, "Do you have Uber or Grab, as they call it over there?" She says, "Yes." I said, "Do you have Instagram?" She says, "Yes." I said, "Do you have WhatsApp?" She says, "Yes." And I listed these things and I said, guess what? So do I. And so does every other Australian have it as well. And I was trying to get them to understand that's what I'm talking about. There's a certain element of consistency in the things that we do as humans that it crosses over all cultures. I'm not talking about very specific things. I'm not talking about the local bus timetable and the times that you eat your meals and go to church. I'm not talking about those things. There's certain elements of what the strategy is all about that connects to the people and the things that are common within their purpose and and what they see as essential to them. I took it further and asked this a question to the lady. I said, and it was just an example of dynamic versus structured. And I said to her, do you have a WhatsApp group? Like, do you have a bunch of girlfriends that you stay connected to? So when you see great deals on bits and pieces in the city, you would share news on where to get great deals and discounts. Singaporeans love to shop. Believe you me, I'd done my research before I went into this meeting. This wasn't off the cuff. I'd thought these things through. And she says yes. And I said, is it fair to assume that you've got a bunch of girlfriends that you've got in a chat group to share this information so you could find great deals? And she said yes. And I said to her, can I ask you a question? I said, oh, is it fair to assume that if you looked into your group chat right now, you would kind of know what your girlfriends are doing in the moment? You wouldn't know exactly, but you would have a sense of what they're up to and what's happening. And she says, yes. And I said, can I ask you a question? Do you ever send these people emails? And she said, no. I said, do you ever set up meetings with these people? And she says, no. And I said, well, isn't it strange that that's how we operate in the office? It's kind of like we do one thing one way when we're away from the office. We engage, we create, we get into each other's pockets quite comfortably in a social setting. But when we come to the office, everything goes off the table. And so now we go back to a very structured and linear way of thinking and a linear way of processing things, which sort of corresponds with my earlier slides. So I shared that with you only because as I was listening to what she was going about, I tried to get her to understand that I wasn't trying to push an agenda. I was just trying to get her to understand that there's different ways of looking at things, and some of these value propositions are transferable across cultures. And so again, why I did this was because back then in Singapore, there was a lot of fluff and noise around expats taking jobs from locals, and they were trying to push a lot of expats away and making sure those jobs went to local Singaporeans. There was a little bit of an imbalance there in the employment market at the time. It was on the news and stuff. So I wanted to make sure that they could see that I was the thinking that I was applying here wasn't a Western thinking or an Australian thinking or the company that I was working for. It was none of those things. It's all about just getting the basics right and to let them know that this is all about them and doing the right thing by them, right? So it was a very interesting conversation to win over those hearts and minds, and we did. The other one is you have to be an engineer because you've got to create a solution glide path on how you're going to actually deliver some of these things and create the output. You got to influence, you got to win, you got to how to win friends and influence people is the Carnegie way of saying it. I used to say, how do you steal candy from the baby and have the baby thank you for stealing the candy? I mean, that's really what it's all about. How do you do that? How do you take someone's desk away from them and give them something else that they wish to have, right? You got to disrupt because you got to get a little bit, you got to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, of course, because, if you just stuck to what everyone wanted, you wouldn't get anything done really. And you got to be an owner. You got to take full responsibility for what you're doing. It belongs to you and you got to own this. And this is a tough one for a lot of folks because a lot of people in the corporate real estate team will pivot towards, well, that's the process and that's what the process tells us and that we're going to do it that way. And the reason they do that is because it's easy to justify. So when it breaks, they can say, well, that's what I was told to do. You can do that if you want, but you got to put your heart into it if you want these things to work. And believe you me, it's extremely rewarding at the end, but it takes a little bit of pressure. I'm not gonna lie, it takes a bit of effort, but it's beautiful when it works. Okay, so that's what owning it's all about. So as we start to head forward, the next sequence is how do we connect the dots. So at the top we've got our listener, our engineer, influencer, disruptor, and then we look at who our audience is, who are the people that we need to win over. Right, we've got the local stakeholders, of course. Yes, we've got the global stakeholders, the people that live in the States that, tick all the boxes and do everything. We've got finance and process owners, IT, HR, workplace folks, security and marketing, etc. and so forth. So we've got the users, the people we serve, the Singaporeans. Those are our customers, by the way, our partners, our customers, our guests. By that way, by customers there, I'm referring to company customers, but I call our users our customers. And then we've got our partners and strategic vendors, within the firewall and external. So within the firewall, that means vendors that are working for us, next to us in the office, that have a laptop that's assigned to our company that can work in. And then you've got outside the firewall, which are, partners, the Jones Lang LaSalle's, the CBREs, the Cushman and Wakefield, the Savills, the Colliers, the folks that you partner with that are outside that obviously play a role in what we do as well. So you've got those folks to work. And then you've got external influences. You've got business cycles, property cycles, landlords, certain competition from other competitors or other folks trying to change our space. So there's a lot of moving parts that we have to sort of balance as we take these things forward, and that's what makes it so interesting and disparate. And this is why we can't, well, at least I believe we got to be a bit of a jack of all trades to understand all these things so we can sort of create shape. Yeah. Now, back to the story, right? At the top end, we got our listener, we got our engineer, the things we saw before, and now we've got, how we do that, right? So if we start to apply a bit more of a different wording to this, so this is process and framework oriented up at the top. This is human centric. So listener, it's all about it being empathy, an exhibition of empathy. An engineer, you're here to solve someone's problems. You're trying to make life easier for them. Yeah, you're trying to influence them, but you're doing it through collaboration. You're trying to win them over, win over their hearts and minds so they can feel that they owned it. They owned the decision, which is great because then they'll live with it and defend it. Instead of a disruptor, you want to be a leader. You want to lead the charge and you want to show them why, or you want them to be able to show others why they're doing the things that they're doing because they're trying to lead from the front versus follow from behind. Owning, and then this is the realist thing. We have to be realistic about this, right? It could win, it could succeed, it could fail, but we need to be realistic in what we're trying to do because at the end of the day, this is going to sit with us, and so we need to be very smart about what we do. We cannot blame others in the context of these things, but we also need to balance out our decision making so we can make strong and invested decisions in what we do. Given that at the end of the day, this is your brand, this is your organization, the people that are in your cohort, the change management teams, the change champions, the executive committees, they own a little bit of all of this as well. So we all need to sort of bring it all together. And so there needs to be an exhibition of realism there with everybody. It's not just one person, right? Now, this is where we start to look at how things start to come together. So as you can see, we have those activities up at the top, and they start to come. I start to look at this on a full life cycle basis. So the strategy to plan piece. This is a process framework, by the way. So strategy to plan. So you build a strategy to obviously plan what you want to do. The idea to offering. So you deliver it, and then you take it through to a point where they can you can offer it and it can be consumed, and then sorry, then you can plan to deliver it. So you take the idea and you convert it into an offering, so it's tangible. You then plan to deliver that offering, then you deliver that offering, then you operate. So again, that would be when you plan to deliver is when you do all your design work at a project, you deliver the project, and you operate the life cycle, the full life cycle of that lease, and then which is the next stage, to operate to disposition. So that's where facilities management other than start to step and start to own the various work streams involved with running a site all the way to the end. So we take a very, very holistic view on all of these things, because there's a lot of activity in the front end here that belong both to myself, the corporate real estate team, and the people that we're serving, because we want to take them on that journey. But when we start to plan and deliver it, it belongs to us, and then we need to facilitate that over a period of time. Now, when we start to look at this, at least this is my world, we had certain activities that then tie back to these. So business committers, when we get the business buy-in or the business ideas, then we build the concept and we all commit to the concept, and we then execute against that concept. Yeah, which means we've got license to execute. You get the business case approval to take the project forward. You then transact with the market, you deliver it, and then you operate it. Now, I've broken these down slightly separately because you can start to see how these things start to tie together. This is all about engagement and validation. Concept is about alignment and proof of concept. Execute is about endorsement and authority. So you're getting everyone's belief in the project, plus you've got authority to execute. You're now engaging with that market, and you're making certain commitments to the market. You entering into heads of agreement with landlords. You're entering into a service level agreements with some of your service providers that are going to support this project. You're going to start to invest capital, and you're going to start to deliver outcomes, and you're going to start to look at service excellence, and obviously the business continuity, and how we keep that running across the full life cycle of the asset. At the bottom here are the stakeholders that we're playing with. Now, this is where things again start to become interesting, because we're taking concepts and we're building workflows. This is more structured, what you see over here. And we have to now connect all these dots, because guess what? At this point over here, you've got people, and you've got egos, and you've got personalities, and this is far more left of field, and can be far more complicated. I've broken it down to three categories. You've got corporate real estate stakeholders, you've got business partners, and you've got service and project owners. I'll step through each of these so you can see it for yourself, right? So if I just pop up to the top, that's that line. Now we can see the corporate real estate stakeholders. Who are these people? Well, again, in a larger corporate real estate organization like many of us work for, you'll start to see that there's a corporate real estate team. There's client relationship managers. They own the relationship with the business, both mostly at a global level, but also at a regional level. You got the finance team, you got the corporate, the global real estate organization that sits on top of this. You've got portfolio management, you've got the delivery teams, the people that actually deliver the services. You've got strategy and planning, you've got global delivery teams that often responsible for delivery of global projects. You've got CRE leadership, so the corporate real estate leadership team, a lot of big people, a lot of big heads, a lot of big stakeholders. You've got operations management, you've got workplace leaders, the guys on the site actually running the workplace. You've got global program managers, people like branding and marketing and other big programs that need to be coupled into all of this, and they own those processes. Technical service managers for the techie stuff like building data centers, for example. Facilities managers, capital projects managers, and workplace experience. So there's a lot of folks playing in this space with different agendas, etc., and so forth, and different priorities. Now, again, you got to connect all these dots. You got to understand what each of them do, and now you need to architect who plays where and how they're going to play and how they're going to start to add value. Okay. The next slide now is, sorry, the section below is our business partners. You've got the IT folks, you've got engineering, corporate IT, and so the guys that do the heavy lifting. You've got safety and security, you've got human resources, you've got legal, you've got the procurement team, accounts payable, incident management, and health and safety. You've got risk, you've got a single point of contact. Okay, so that's one person that sort of owns everything, right? You've got the tax team, you've got to deal with those guys. You've got treasury, bank guarantees and deposits and stuff. All impacted employees are your partners. Everyone there is impacted. So you're going to have a lot of people coming to you from all parts of the business asking all sorts of questions. And so, they're your business partners as much as you are a servant to them. You got your lab and your data center community, the people that run those environments and how they get built and how they get run and how they get access. You got government and corporate affairs. You might be doing stuff in certain tax havens or certain obligations or commitments we've made to governments, maybe in Singapore to do X and Y, keeping those folks happy. You got country jurisdiction management, different laws for different countries, mean you can do different things. That's more of a legal aspect. You got business unit target acquisition, so the guys that are acquiring businesses all the time, mergers and acquisitions. You've got to consult with them as well because they might be looking at procuring a business that might work for or work against this project. You got your BDMs, you got your finance guys, marketing, branding, and the list goes on. Now, the ones I've got the hatched, the dotted lines across, these are our service provider partners that don't really sit in our business a lot of the time, but they're key to our success. So, service provider of capital projects, that could be your Johnson Controls, it could be your ISSs, it could be your CBREs, it could be anybody for that matter, Jones Lang LaSalle, those guys that do your capital projects, the guys that do your real estate, the guys that do your facilities management. Some of these landlords become our business partners, as frustrating as that can be. Some landlords are fantastic, others are very opportunistic. You got the design managers, the external guys, the Moser, and the Genslers, the others that sit outside our business that we work with. You got our legal, external legal, and then obviously you got the transformation of the mergers and acquisitions. Those are the Ernst and Youngs, the Deloittes, etc., and so forth. Right. So we can see we've got quite a large community of interests. And for anybody that's, been in this game for a while, this might not be too foreign to you, but for those of you who don't work within a corporate real estate environment, welcome to our world. And when I'm often dealing with our service providers, always frustrated because we can't make decisions quickly. Well, this is kind of why. This is what we have to deal with here. It can be complicated. And so if we start to step forward and we start to put these things together, these square boxes just represent the things that we've socialized right now, but we start to bring these ones together. We've got our facilities management, our capital projects, and our workplace experience team, which then come together, right? Then obviously form part of that community of delivery, which is where we work. And you start to go down here, you could start to see other influences. And I've just used real estate for this example. So again, the next level of supply pipelines, metro economics. Is the market growing or contracting? We've got building economics and the efficiency of buildings and compliance and premises compliance and title legitimacy. Who owns the building? Are we dealing with the right people? Some parts of the world, this is a big deal. Legal jurisdictions and execution authority, who signs the leases, who can't sign the leases. Different countries have got different rules around these things, local best practices, and the list goes on and on and on. So I probably don't need to go through all of these, but you can get a context of the separate layer of parts that we have to work with that are outside our span of control, but have material influence on how we do things. And keep in mind, I've got multiple countries down here because at the moment I'm talking about one project, but you could be doing multiple projects across multiple countries, and all of this will be completely different. And how you then start to stack those things up. And so the next slide is really about the catalog of skills. And I've tried to bring these together as best I possibly can. And in a couple of categories. So the first one is essentially real estate. The second one is facilities management. The other one is capital projects. Then HR, stroke workplace and design, and then IT. You got your corporate, and you got analytical and soft skills. And this is where things start to become interesting, because you can see that the amount of skills that play a role in what we do are quite substantial. Now, again, I'm the kind of guy that I want to learn as much as I can about everything, so I can be a little bit of a jack of all trades, and I can navigate these swim lanes and be able to get things done. While some processes and some companies aren't that supportive of this, they like people to stick to their lane and be able to do one thing and one thing only. As a corporate real estate person, you'll learn real quick that it's very hard to do it that way, and so this is what you have to learn. Again, looking at real estate, you got strategy reporting, finance, law, transaction management, lease management, economics, financial modeling, and all sorts of good stuff. Facilities management, you've got vendor management, you've got IFM, lifecycle management, logistics, security, defects, and building info modeling and maintenance planning. On capital projects, you've got service level agreements, you've got playbooks, and the list goes on, and the list goes on, and the list goes on. So what am I trying to share with you here today is the fact that in order for, at least what I believe, in order for you to really excel at what you do, you'll need to get continuously curious. You need to step into these environments. You need to ask the difficult questions. You need to allow yourself to be embarrassed, because the more you do that, you'll be able to tool yourself with the skills that you need to be able to jump from lane to lane and create the outcome. Remember, the output of this project, unfortunately, still sits with corporate real estate. It's ironic because you can do the greatest project in the world and they're going to really celebrate your success at one point, but they'll take all the gratitude when they can. They'll take it all. But if it goes south, if it goes poorly, your name will be on the list of everything. And that's why I think a lot of people take the cautious route and just do it the way that everyone else has always done it, because it's easy to defend, and especially when things go wrong. So it's a pretty big call to take the big leap and to take on these responsibilities. But I believe that as if you were able to insert yourself into these workflows and learn as much as you can, there's not much that can go wrong. There's a lot that goes on in the background. I think one of the areas that I spent a lot of time was the IT space. I became very fascinated with digital workflows and how they are disparate to physical workflows, and trying to understand, why does somebody choose to work from home? Like, in the office, we give them the best chair on the market, the best desk on the market, the best ambient temperature you can possibly get with aircon and everything. But the person, when they have their choice, they choose to sit at their dining room table on a rotten old chair on a table that's not appropriate and wobbles. Like, why do they do that? So I try to look at, maybe we've got this wrong. Maybe we were focused on the wrong things. And if you start to drill into why, you start to unearth these things, and you start to build up a knowledge of how will the individual observe the success to be? Because remember, they will decide for them as to whether the project was successful or not you, right? So getting into their brain for me was a big deal, and I was very fascinated in how technology had influenced the way we do things and how it continued to influence the way we do things. So I had a very big strategy around learning that, because technology was going to change every day, and so as that technology changed, we couldn't update workplaces to correspond with that. But so how can we do it differently? Again, that's a story for another day, but really talks down to our very, very, very important part of what we do, and we're going to invest a bit of time to learn. So, in summary, you know. I read this. It was a Bill Gates quote, and I really enjoyed it. Right? And I always use it at the end of my talks. But it starts like this. So the first rule of any technology used in a business is that automation applied to an efficient operation will magnify the efficiency. The second is that automation applied to an inefficient operation will magnify the inefficiency, and that's a Bill Gates quote. And that's critical, because it's a little bit like, if you just think about it for a moment and just think about how you use your mobile phone today. It's an intelligent device. It's a one device that's very intelligent, and it does a lot of things very quickly and very smartly. Um, Now, if you were to step back 10 years and replicate the way we were doing that using, an old Nokia phone with a Palm Pilot, etc., and so forth, we would end up with a lot of devices. We just wouldn't be able to keep up, right? So, as we start to think about how we build new workplaces and think differently in the context of what I've been learning, it's like I'm trying to say to myself, if you start to look at how we use an old mobile phone and we build an office like that, but we try and connect all the dots, we're going to be there forever. We need to look at it from a platform level, like Apple does it, for example, and scale that way. And so what this is all about is trying to push ourselves to think differently. So yeah, so what we're trying to eliminate essentially is the bureaucracy associated with what we do, non-value added activities, the duplication of effort and complexity. This is all about operational efficiency. And I believe, at least in my view, by understanding a little bit about everything, you could start to tweak your conversation, you could start to tweak your narrative and build context around different ways of architecting outcomes. The last example I'll share with you to give you food for thought is, again, using the mobile phone story again. Let's just go back and think about how we use mobile phones back in the day with all those devices, and now we've got one device that did everything thing. And I always used to say, can you imagine if we took the way we did it then and we did it the way we're doing it today, we'd be carrying a satchel of devices around with us. And my mind always turns to the way that Apple have done it, and it's a perfect example of operational efficiency. So what Apple have got, they've got a intelligent device and intelligent platform when they bring these two together, right? So, your Apple Watch doesn't just connect to your Apple iPhone, it pairs. Your personality crosses across those two devices, right? And the intelligence crosses across those two devices. So both those devices get intelligent at the same time. Now, as you add more devices, that can scale exponentially. And so if you think about that ecosystem, as you're adding more devices to that ecosystem, the ecosystem gets smarter and smarter and smarter. So again, you're scaling exponentially. Yeah. And so if you think about that, then you update one, do an iOS update, and basically everything gets intelligent at the same time. So you could start to scale and multiply. So not only have you got one device getting very efficient, but you've got multiple smart devices all getting efficient at the same time and at the same level of scale. So you can grow things to another level and take it to another level that could never be replicated if you did it the old way, which is again just adding lots of devices to your Nokia phone. So that's just an example of what I'm trying to share with you here today. So I hope that was interesting for you. This just gives you, again, just context to what I've been working on and some of the thought processes that went through my mind. Feel free to shoot any questions across to me through your facilitator there today. I'll gladly try and offer you a response if I can. But I wish you all the very best with your studies and stay safe. Cheers.